David Rosenhan was one of the most divisive figures in the field of modern psychiatry and psychology. He was born in New Jersey in 1929 and graduated with an undergrad in mathematics before going on to obtain a master's in economics and a doctorate in psychology from Columbia University in 1958. I was unable to uncover what occupied Rosenhan for the next decade or so, but in 1971 he was made a professor of law and psychology at Stanford University, a position he retained until his retirement in 1998. He was considered an expert on the psychology of trial law and had particular interest in the psychodynamics of juries, in particular their ability to abide by judges' instructions to disregard evidence that had been ruled inadmissible. He was a gifted orator with the ability to hold the attention of hundreds of students due to his dynamic and charismatic style. In 1973, an explosive article appeared in the prestigious journal Science on being sane in insane places, authored by Rosenhan. It famously recounted how Rosenhan and 7 others with no history of any mental illness, whom he termed pseudo-patients, had gone separately to different psychiatric hospitals and gotten admitted based on a single symptom: a voice saying thud, hollow, empty. Aside from falsifying their names and employment, all other aspects of their histories, relationships, and experiences were conveyed accurately. The participants were instructed to deny the existence of any symptoms as soon as they were admitted and to behave normally. All except one pseudo-patient was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and the admissions ranged from 7 to 52 days, with each receiving various early antipsychotic medications which they generally disposed of. All were discharged with the tag schizophrenia in remission. Rosenhan claimed that his motivation was to test if sanity can be accurately distinguished from insanity, or whether insanity is simply a product of being in an insane environment. From the outset of the paper, his antipathy towards the psychiatric profession is clear. He makes no secret of his belief that diagnostic classification and labeling is a waste of time, serves no purpose, and is downright harmful. In actual fact, Rosenhan had submitted himself to the experiment, having challenged his psychology students to themselves try to get admitted to a psychiatric hospital for first-hand experience of mental illness, but thought it best to check it out for himself first. Rosenhan's experience was a harrowing one, and he forbade his students from following suit. Rosenhan's article was published at a pivotal time which enabled it to ride a wave of anti-psychiatry sentiment sweeping the USA, a facet of the broader counterculture movement of the 60s and 70s. The article also coincided with a time when psychiatry was facing increasing pressure to declassify homosexuality as a mental illness, which it resisted until 1973. By this time, the reputation of psychiatry had diminished significantly amongst the wider medical fraternity due to the rise, in part, of the psychoanalysts from the 30s and 40s onwards. By the 1960s, 66% of psychiatrists in the USA worked in private practice, profiting from the worried well, whilst those with serious mental disorders languished in mental asylums. Such were these attacks against psychiatry. By the early 70s, the APA warned its members that the very existence of their profession was in danger. Psychiatrists were quick to denounce Rosenhan's apparent attack on the very legitimacy of their work. Robert Spitzer, architect of the significantly overhauled DSM-3, launched a scathing and systematic rebuttal in a 1975 article in which he deems Rosenhan's study to be logic in remission and pseudoscience dressed up as science. Seymour Ketty, the neuroscientist credited with proving the essential involvement of genetics in schizophrenia, highlighted the methodological flaw of the Rosenhan study, saying, "If I were to drink a quart of blood and, concealing what I had done, come to the emergency room of any hospital vomiting blood, the behaviour of the staff would be quite predictable. If they labelled and treated me as having a bleeding peptic ulcer, I doubt that I could argue convincingly that medical science does not know how to diagnose that condition." Despite these prominent critiques, Rosenhan's study continues to be taught in undergraduate psychology courses worldwide to this day. The writer Susanna Kalin has delved deeper into Rosenhan's study than anyone before, inspired by her own experience of insanity, having been misdiagnosed as mentally ill whilst actually suffering from anti-NMDA receptor encephalitis. She writes in her 2019 book, The Great Pretender, that despite several years of following leads and tracking down files, she could find records of only 3 of the pseudopatients, interviewing the 2 still alive. She discovered that the account of one, alias Harry Lando, had been entirely omitted from the study, as he had found his hospital admission to be an overwhelmingly positive experience, which clearly was at odds with Rosenhan's agenda. She also proved via medical records that Rosenhan's claim that the pseudopatients acted entirely normally following their admission was not accurate, with Rosenhan himself embellishing his symptoms. She goes as far to cast doubt on the very existence of 6 of the pseudopatients, given the utter lack of paper trail. Reading through Rosenhan's experiment fills one with many emotions. Setting aside the dubious ethics and flawed research design of having people act in a particular way in order to trick others so as to prove your point, Rosenhan highlights some issues of great relevance today. His account of the depersonalization experienced by patients is deeply affecting and should be reflected on by anyone working in a psychiatric unit today. It also emphasizes the importance of questioning existing diagnoses and continually assessing their validity. I agree with his concern about the impact of labels and the reality of being seen only through the lens of mental illness after these labels are given. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation on a topic I have found most fascinating.